So this is the last lecture on Things Fall Apart, and it's about the last couple pages of the book. So if you haven't already done so, please pause the video and read those last few pages all the way through before we talk. I want to combine your first impressions as a reader with some additional information that might give it more meaning. Okay, so I'll pause for just a couple seconds, and you can pause the video. Okay, at the very end of chapter 24, we have a moment on page 205 where Okonkwo has cut down the colonial messenger, right, who is an African but who works for the colonial government, and he's cut him down with a machete. And Okonkwo has a moment in which his heart breaks, right? So he describes his feeling like, if we look at the very bottom of 204. In a flash, Okonkwo drew his machete. The messenger crouched to avoid the blow, but it was useless. Okonkwo's machete descended twice, and the man's head lay beside his uniform body. The waiting backcloth jumped into tumultuous life, and the meeting was stopped. Okonkwo stood looking at the dead man. He knew that Umofia would not go to war. He knew because they had let the other messengers escape. They had broken into tumult instead of action. He discerned fright in that tumult. He heard voices asking, "Why did he do it?" He wiped his machete on the sand and went away. And that's the last we're going to hear of Okonkwo. So the question is, at this moment, right, what is it in this scene that can explain for us why the next thing we find out is that he's committed suicide by hanging himself, right? Like, what here is the motivation that we're supposed to infer from this description? And I think it has to do with how Okonkwo looks around and what he's expecting from other people. It wasn't merely the fact that he had been humiliated, but that he sees that his village is no longer that which he thought it was, right? It has transformed to an extraordinary extent in a way that makes their defeat something that they are not resisting, right? And given that Okonkwo really only has one way to understand the meaning of fear, and that fear for him is always a mark of cowardice, right? He has to decide that his people are not what he thought that they were. Now, he might be right or he might be wrong, but at that moment he feels that they have abandoned not just him, right, but their entire fire, right, that which made them them. So by the time we get to chapter 25 on the next page, what's really interesting is we don't get those moments of reflection in Okonkwo's head. That's not part of the narrative. We don't have a scene of him walking out to find a tree and looping the rope and all that kind of stuff, because at this point Achebe is kind of telling us as readers, look, either you know why he committed suicide or you don't. I got nothing left for you. Either you know or you don't, right? And one person who clearly doesn't is going to be the white commissioner who comes to visit and investigate. So he came to find out what's happening to his messenger, right? And when he arrives, he can't find Okonkwo, but he finds Abirika, who, if you remember, I previously said, I think is really Achebe's voice in the text, right? He is a more measured, reasonable version of Okonkwo, somebody who appreciates Okonkwo and also recognizes his limitations. Okay, so the interpreter asks, in the commissioner's words, "Which among you is called Okonkwo?" "He is not here," replied Abirika. "Where is he?" "He's not here." And the commissioner became angry and red in the face. He warned the men that unless they produced Okonkwo forthwith, he would lock them all up. And the men murmured among themselves, and Abirika spoke up again. "We can take you where he is, and perhaps your men will help us." The commissioner did not understand what Abirika meant when he said, "Perhaps your men will help us." One of the most infuriating habits of these people was their love of superfluous words, he thought. Now, if you think back to that first scene, that did little to increase the plot of the story, right? But that struck many of us, like, as being important for some other reason we couldn't quite figure. And that whole proverb of proverbs themselves being the palm oil with which words are eaten, right? That idea that anything, like, that this is superfluous talk reflects the fact that the commissioner doesn't understand what's happening, not that it's actually superficial and meaningless, right? This is him, what he says, what he responds actually reveals the extent of his ignorance, right? Because we understand what this is about. Okay, so they come through the woods and they see Okonkwo's body, at which point the district commissioner starts to interview them about this, as though they weren't close friends with this person who's dead, right? The district commissioner changed instantaneously. The resolute administrator in him gave way to the student of primitive customs. Why can't you take him down yourselves? He asked. And we know that's through an interpreter. It's against our custom, said one of the men. It is an abomination for a man to take his own life. It's an offense against the earth, and a man who commits it will not be buried by his clansmen. His body is evil, and only strangers may touch it. That's why we asked your people to bring him down, because you're strangers. And then the commissioner continues asking these kind of like anthropological questions, as though these people weren't emotionally invested in what was happening. So the commissioner basically says, okay, my guys can take him down. And then for probably the first part in the text, we're really given a very clear sense of the colonial thought process here with the commissioner. And remembering that this is the last paragraph of the whole novel, and thus carries a special import or a special stress that if this paragraph was placed in another place, it might not carry. Okay. The commissioner went away, taking 3 or 4 of the soldiers with him. In the many years in which he had toiled to bring civilization to different parts of Africa, he had learned a number of things. One of them was that a district commissioner must never attend to such undignified details as cutting a hanged man from a tree. Such attention would give the natives a poor opinion of him. There is nothing we've read in this entire book that would suggest that this would be the case. Right? It's merely the commissioner bringing his own Western baggage of ideas of servants and masters to bear on his understanding of the situation. In the book which he planned to write, he would stress that point, and as he walked back to the court, he thought about that book. Every day brought him some new material. The story of the man who had killed a messenger and hanged himself would make interesting reading. So why does the commissioner think that Okonkwo killed himself? He thinks Okonkwo killed himself because, having murdered a messenger, he was afraid of the discipline that he would have to bear, that he would be arrested and prosecuted, and so in order to avoid that, he committed suicide. But is that why Okonkwo committed suicide? Seems pretty inconsistent with Okonkwo. Okonkwo committed suicide because he was profoundly disappointed in his people, not because he was worried about the fact that somebody might come after him or because he was scared. There's nothing about Okonkwo that would suggest that was his motivation. So the story of the man who had killed a messenger and hanged himself would make interesting reading. One could almost write a whole chapter on him. Perhaps not a whole chapter, but a reasonable paragraph at any rate. There was so much else to include, and one must be firm in cutting out details. He had already chosen the title of the book after much thought: The Pacification of the Primitive Tribes of the Lower Niger. So the commissioner thinks that the last 209 pages you just read could maybe be a paragraph in his book. At this point, you're invested in the story in a whole bunch of different ways. One of the ways you're invested is that you just read 209 pages and you want them to mean something, right? And the commissioner then, when he says none of this means anything, it's all just a flourish or a footnote, it's not the really important thing, that should offend you on multiple levels at the same time. And it's meant to. That's part of what Achebe is trying to do here. And so when you hit the title of the book, The Pacification of the Primitive Tribes of the Lower Niger, it's hard to even focus on which part of that is the worst, right? You have pacification, like as though they were the violent ones that needed to be brought into harmony. Of the primitive tribes, would you particularly call any of this unsophisticated, any of what you've read? Or is it in fact complication on top of complication, where you have hierarchies and other hierarchies that cross-cut at each other, where you have proverbs, you have traditions, you have stories that are moving in the same direction except for the ones that aren't, where you have a large individuated group of people who manage to get along even though they're all incredibly different and very human, being neither angels nor demons, right? And the Lower Niger, did any of these people ever refer to where they lived as the Lower Niger? Right? This is all about the ways in which, at the end, the attempt to know a group becomes inevitably part of a process of trying to conquer them, right? Which is a terrifying sort of idea because it doesn't suggest what you can do on the other side. And so much of this is less trying to urge any particular action as to explain in a fictional universe, right? Where the author can control the rules and control the outcomes a little bit, the process by which culture played a critical role in colonization. And that when we say that, it's not just about the culture of the oppressor, but also the culture of the people themselves, how they responded, why they made the choices that they did, why they didn't notice when some other choices were being made. There's a whole emphasis on trying to reduce colonization to a story of one side had guns and the other didn't. And this is really trying to take a deep breath and look at it with a lot more nuance. And by the end, no matter what you think of Okonkwo, he deserved better than what happened, right? He didn't deserve to commit himself to a death that he believed would turn him into an evil spirit for the rest of eternity. Okay, take care. That's the end of that book, and I'd love to hear any more thoughts you have. Go ahead and put them up on the discussion board. Take care.